Welcome. Don't worry if you weren't here last time, because it's been recorded. I'm sure Brigitte will put the link on for you afterwards. I ask because the objective today is similar to last time in the way that I'm hopefully going to tell you something you don't know about dyslexia this time. And especially, and this is what I find most useful, so it will be sharing practical tips that you can use in the classroom. And there may be a little overlap with the webinar last time, because there is an overlap between dyslexia, neurodiversity, and different specific educational needs. If you have any questions, could you try and put them in the chat box? If I have time to mention them while I'm going through, I will, but otherwise I'm going to leave time at the end to answer questions. And if you're watching a recording, then please get in touch with me if you do have any questions, because I'd love to connect and share. So we will get started. First of all, what is dyslexia? So dyslexia is many things, but basically, and here we can see my first spelling mistake, there will probably be several. Dyslexia is a difference in cerebral architecture. It's when we see PET scans of people with dyslexia, there is pretty often a difference in the brain of somebody who has dyslexia and somebody who doesn't. So that means that it is present, or at least it is possibly present from before birth. So it can be deficits in the cerebellum, that's the rear lower region. Sometimes we see the two hemispheres lack symmetry. And we can see in PET scans that people with dyslexia may use a different hemisphere to do different language activities. It's also been shown to be genetic. So there's not one specific chromosome that is or not responsible for dyslexia. But many studies have drawn conclusions towards the chromosome 6, noticing differences there in people with dyslexia. And interestingly enough, that is the chromosome which is responsible for autoimmune diseases. I'm not sure if there's any link been shown there. So dyslexia can be genetic, as we've mentioned, and it can be hereditary. There is a 40 to 60% chance of a child, especially a son, being dyslexic if they have one dyslexic parent, and again, the father. Other things to look out for. So it seems there may be different causes for dyslexia, and that is why there are different themes, different reasons for it, but also different things that different students may find difficult, which we'll look at in a bit more detail. So obviously reading and writing, but it could also mean things like collecting one's ideas for oral presentations, or the pronunciation of certain words too. So it has been linked to visual stress in about half the cases of dyslexia in various studies. So this could be the cells that are in the retina. And it's also been linked to something called the Meares-Irlen syndrome, which is so it's now been separated from dyslexia, but in the past, dyslexia was called Meares-Irlen syndrome. It was discovered by two educational psychologists who noticed that people with dyslexia have difficulty with the saccading, as they call it. When we read, we don't just look at all the letters. for you, that'll probably be that way. We don't look at all the letters one after the other. We sort of move backwards and forwards between the letters and the sounds in a word, and also between the words, the word that came before and the words that came afterwards. And it was Miles Iren that came up with the use of these coloured overlays that you may have seen. We'll talk a little bit about those later. They're definitely in my useful toolbox of things. In some cases, dyslexia has been linked to glue ear, so hearing problems, and the idea that if you can't hear the phonics, it can be difficult to repeat it and to work out the link between the sounds and the letters. Dyslexia exists in every language, although it is more obvious in some, especially English, because English is very phonetically heavy. There's not necessarily a link between the sound and the spelling, as you've probably noticed. This is why languages such as Italian, for example, often the case with Italian students is they don't really notice that they're dyslexic until they start maybe higher studies or university, when there's a lot more reading, because the Italian language uses less sounds and has a sort of more regular spelling pattern. It affects between 10 and 20% of the population, again, depending on whereabouts in the world. That doesn't mean some countries are more likely to be to have people with dyslexia. It means they're probably doing more tests. Maybe they've got a higher percentage of literacy in their country. And it is probably the most common specific educational need. Approximately 80% of people with a specific educational need will have dyslexia. And it is said to coexist with ADHD. But again, especially in young learners, this can be a chicken and egg issue. Do the young learners find it difficult to read and write and take all that on because they're having trouble concentrating? Or do young learners find it difficult to concentrate in class because the reading and the writing is taking this extra cognitive load? But in any case, it's probably one of the sort of first and most studied special educational needs. And that probably explains why it's widespread, because with time, as with many things, it's become more and more accepted everywhere in the world. And if you have dyslexia in one language, you will have it in any other languages you speak. Although, as I said, with English, it's more obvious than in others. There's one case that I have found of a Japanese lady who had dyslexia in English, but not in Japanese, or maybe the other way around. Personally, so the number of people who have been diagnosed has increased over the last few decades, but that doesn't mean the number of people with dyslexia has increased. It's just that people spot it more. It's more accepted, so parents are going to be fine about it being tested. There are more tests perhaps available now. And when I look at some of my friends with dyslexia who may not be diagnosed, it's quite obvious that in the past they were just the dunces at the back of the class, and it went undetected in many cases. And then these people went on to become brilliant carpenters, brilliant taxi drivers, many other things. And not relying so much on reading and writing, their dyslexia has gone unnoticed. And we're still seeing this to a certain extent with the parents of students who now we will assess and say maybe they should, have you thought maybe dyslexia could be an issue for your child. And often the parent's answer is, no, 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 I was just the same at school, da, da, da. And of course, that's probably because the parent had dyslexia and had the same difficulties at school. So I think that might explain that. There's still debate on how we actually assess and test students for dyslexia, because one of the common way is for there to be a difference, a marked difference between reading and writing skills and other skills, intelligence, verbal intelligence, etc. The problem with this is that by relying on IQ tests, which are pretty unreliable as it is, because they are designed basically for the Western white male population, we're not getting accurate readings. And also you could have a student who has other difficulties, including maybe in a QI test, but also has dyslexia. It's also important to think about our foreign language students, especially our refugee students, who may not have been assessed in their country of origin and are finding learning a language more challenging. This could be one of the reasons. It's not just because you're from another country. So it's important to take all that into consideration. I mentioned last time I saw you all executive functions, and I'd like to mention it again because it's important to remember that dyslexia in all its forms is not just difficulty reading and writing. That may be the main difficulty. That's probably going to be something that students find difficult. However, there are other functions that will be affected that many of us, and even sometimes our students, are not aware, but other functions that will be affected by a specific educational need and by this neurodiversity. And they are inhibition. So maybe these students will be the ones interrupting, butting into class. It may affect attention and focus. Like I said, it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. If something is more complicated, it may make it harder for students to focus for long periods, or the periods you'd like them to focus for. Working memory will be affected. So even if that's having listened, even if that's oral, for example, giving complicated instructions, do this and then this and this, the students' working memory difficulties may make it complicated for them to remember the various stages. So we could do a whole webinar, I think, on giving instructions. The day I know how to give perfect instructions, I will be shouting it from the treetops and giving webinars on it. But one of the things I can suggest is breaking down the instructions and writing them on the board or somewhere the students can see it. And again, depending on their language level, I would not have any trouble with either using symbols like the symbol to write and just page numbers for exercises, etc., or even writing it in their language. If my objective is for the students to be able to follow the class, my objective is not necessarily for them to understand, read and fill in the missing verb in another language. The only time we use words like verb and adjective is in the classroom anyway. I very rarely use them in real life when I'm in the coffee shop, anything like that. Cognitive flexibility will affect a student's way of looking at a problem. And this may mean it is less flexible, but it may also just be very different to what you expect. And it's interesting, I work as a special education needs coordinator. One of my roles is to go in and observe students in the classroom. And observing some students this week in a maths lesson, it was interesting to note that the 2 or 3 students with specific education needs were the ones that went about the maths problem in a completely different way to the rest of the class. Still got the same answer, but instead of timesing something by 4 and then taking something off, they took what in the first place and then timesed it by 3, etc. I also have the example, unfortunately, I've not put the slide on, of a student a few years ago. We were doing a listening comprehension and they had to draw various things, draw a car the same size, as big as, bigger, smaller. And the instructions were to draw a tree and draw a bigger one next to it. And the student had drawn a wonderful tree and next to it a huge number 1. And I looked at this and then I realized that the instructions were to draw a tree and a bigger 1 next to it. So that's some of the differences you may notice in some of your students. And this, of course, can be really useful for their problem solving. I often find that it's my students with specific educational needs that come up with the most creative and interesting ideas. If you want to do a warm-up or a finishing activity like how many uses can you find for a paperclip or for a cabbage, it's often these students that will have the most ideas, the most creative ones anyway. So our lesson plan today is to look through a few of these things and how you can use them to support your learners with dyslexia. The first one we're going to look at, therefore, is the worksheets. First of all, so personally now, with all our devices and technology, I find the easiest thing is to put the worksheet on a learning platform, be it Google Classroom or be it Google Drive, or put it somewhere where the students can then change the font and everything they want themselves. They can make it bigger, smaller, they can change the color, etc. But if you are writing your own worksheets, then think about font. So the best fonts for students with dyslexia, and of course, all these ideas are not just for your students with dyslexia. What works for one will work for all. So by using a simple font, such as Arial or Times New Roman, for all of your students, it will make life a lot easier for all of them, not just those students with dyslexia. Even myself, I find this font quite complicated to read. So it's not a question of preparing different sheets for different people. Just the same thing will work for everybody. Think also about the size of the writing, ideally 12 to 14 points. Don't try and cram everything in onto a page. Again, space it out if you can. And normally, Word, for example, will do this automatically, but make sure that the space between the letters is not too big and is significantly smaller than the space between the words, as you can see here in these examples. I'm sure you can see the difficulty there would be in reading that. And again, so space between the letters and between the words, this should be automatic, but you can check it in all your settings and see how it looks. It's always better to use bold rather than capital letters, because capital letters have different shapes. They look different. And underlining can make it complicated to see where one word ends and another starts. So when for your titles or sub-paragraphs, use bold. That's the best option. rather than capital letters, which also look like you're shouting. Oh, another spelling. And if possible, and ChatGPT can be your friend here, when writing a text, a shorter text will help, 60 to 70 characters. Just a quick question here. Native speaker books for kids with dyslexia. Yes, there are more and more books for dyslexia. Kindle has a dyslexia font. There is a specific dyslexia font, which I've not given an example of here, but which is the letters are thick at the bottom. And there are more and more books available for students with dyslexia. Think about having several columns or just writing one line. Columns, it's going to be difficult to remember not to go across and to go down. And also, even for us, it's hard when you get down to the bottom to go back up to the top, especially if it's on a screen. So if possible, try and only use one column. Can you ask me your question at the end, Anthony? Don't forget, note it down. I'll come back to it. Always align the text to the left. It's quite tempting to align it centrally so it looks pretty and there's no jagged edges on the end. But if you centralize it, it will mean that you're changing the space between some of the words, and that will make things more complicated. So give up a teeny bit in the way of style for making it easier and keeping the same space between words. And again, and I'll come back to this when we look at reading comprehensions, break up long texts. It's very simple, and I see it when I'm been correcting the work of some of my students. Looking at just a page of text or two, it's very demoralizing. Paragraphs and just even a couple of lines space between paragraphs are very useful, as are section headings to help people find their place and to draw attention and to help us concentrate. And as I said at the beginning, if possible, send it in a format the students can change, and then they can change anything they like. The reason I hope you notice that my slides are designed to be dyslexia friendly in general, which is why I use dark blue and not black. Some students find the black text on white quite difficult. Some of mine actually swap the format in their iPads and prefer a white text on a black background, or people suggest using pastel paper if possible. But a simpler version than pastel paper is often just to use recycled paper, because recycled paper is not as white and does not have the same glare as new paper does, and is better for the environment. So try that. That's the worksheet. Are there any questions about the worksheet before I move on? Keep them going if you do. One of the things which I find help my students the most of all is scaffolding. I see that my students with learning difficulties find it hard to get started. Things are tougher. Remember, procrastination is because it's easier not to do the task and to feel uncomfortable with it than it is to do it. So we need to kickstart and to make the task easier so that everybody can access it. And these are simple ways of differentiating, rather than have different levels of worksheet, different levels of task. By using scaffolding, you can help the students who need more help to have access to the task. So this could be a grammar exercise where you could have some phrases that students have to finish with their own ideas, or it could just be a gap fill, which is going to be easier. If you have a gap fill, you could have the suggestions at the top. You could tell your students, those of you who want an extra challenge, why don't you cover up the suggestions and see if you can do it without them? The examples are really important. And I think when we write our own tests, it's important to remember to give examples, and not only give examples, but encourage our students to read through it. So when I start doing an exercise with my students, one of the things we always do is read the instructions together and read the example, because students are often headline blind. They don't read the first 2 inches of a page and they just get down to it. Whereas in fact, all the useful information is in that part. And that's a learning strategy. I think it's important for our students to get into the habit. Read the header, read the explanation that is under the title, and read the example. I also take time with my students to write checklists, which may include just this kind of information. And at the beginning, especially at the beginning of the year, take time when you're doing exercises, when you're doing reading comprehensions or listening comprehensions, to write out a checklist of things that need to be done. Students can make these into posters. They can use them to teach other students, which is a brilliant way of learning. You can put them on your learning platform for students to look at, to remember when they need them. The students who need it, you can laminate them and make them into placemats they keep on their desks. Just checklists so they know what to do in what order. Working in pairs is another way, of course, of scaffolding and supporting your learners with difficulties, especially in writing exercises. I love doing pair or group writing activities, mainly because otherwise I feel it's a bit boring. It's quite stressful. It always feels like a test when students write in class. Whereas by having a group writing, you can give each student different roles. You can have who's the ideas monitor, who is actually going to be the scribe. Do we have a grammar and vocab checklist person? Is there a walking dictionary who's going to check the spelling? Who's going to check the plan? It makes everybody feel useful. It uses everybody's skills to produce a piece of work together. And then by reading it all together, it can help all of the students improve their writing skills. So students can do it together on paper, or again on Google Drive, where everybody can add and change things. I realize not everybody has access to technology in the classroom, but I have noticed that especially writing on technology is so useful for students, because it means they can easily edit, they can add things, they can go back. It saves all these little stars with extra paragraphs at the bottom. All of these things are learning strategies, and I really think it's important and really worthwhile. The more time we teach our students, we spend helping our students learn how to learn, rather than actually learning what to learn. This pays back all the time. All these things you do at the beginning of a course, you're going to use again and again. Every time they do a reading comp, every time they do a writing activity together. And another way you can differentiate the work is to talk in terms of minimum and maximum learning. So what is the minimum I want? I want everybody to be able to do the first 3 of these exercises perfectly. Even if you only do 3, but with no mistakes, that is brilliant. Or my minimum today is I want everybody to write at least 1 paragraph. Or I want everybody to come up with 5 ideas is the minimum, and they can be bullet points. And then my maximum is going to be the whole exercise done, the maximum is going to be several paragraphs which have the spelling checked, or the maximum is going to be anything that's going to push your learners to go to their maximum. But that, we all remember, the minimum, good enough, is good enough. If you can do better, do your best. If you today, today your best is 30%, then if you give 30%, you've given 100%. And I think students should remember that. And as I always say, the classroom is where we should make our mistakes. So I would not hesitate to push my students, do what you can. Feedback is an important part of learning, and mistakes are how we learn. So do what you can and make sure you've made some mistakes. If you've not made any mistakes, you've not pushed yourself far enough. So some of the practical ways, and of course reading and writing are going to be probably more challenging for our students with dyslexia, and listening, as we'll look at in a minute. So practical ways of actually lowering the cognitive load of a reading comprehension. First of all, you could offer different texts. You could offer shorter texts. Again, ChatGPT is your friend. Copy the text that you are going to use and write it in ChatGPT saying, could you give me the same information for the same level, A2, B1, but only using 150, 200 words? Or put the original text in with the original questions. Can you write me the same text that will answer, I can use the same questions for, but an easier version? And then on the day, ask your students to choose. It's just like going to a restaurant. Are you feeling risky? Are you going to take something short and simple? Are you going for the whole feast? A little bit on the side? Choose which sheet you want. You could just do the two different texts on either side of a sheet and see which one students go for. When you put your text and your questions on a sheet, if the text goes over both sides, or make sure students have access to the questions while they're reading the whole text. So that might mean putting your questions on a separate page. Remember the issues with short-term memory. What we're testing students on here is their reading understanding, not can they remember the question while they read through the text again. So make sure they can have the questions visible while reading the text. That might mean you put the questions, perhaps you could show the questions up on the board while doing the text, while they read, so that they can always see the questions. Could some of your students listen first? Many of mine use read and write, or Word also has a dictation module, so that students could listen to the text before doing the reading comprehension, which will save them time and mental energy of reading a long and complicated text, which they probably won't remember the beginning of the text while they're at the end. And it's going to be more complicated to remember the questions while remembering the text. So if they could just listen to it once or twice before they start work, that might save a lot of time for them. Another thing I'm very fond of doing yes, thank you, Jen Christian. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your first name. It could be test or it could be text. It depends. But the thing that I do try and do when I can, especially if it's a longer text in a test, is just every paragraph or so, add the questions to that paragraph, or number your paragraphs and then put a number or letter might be easier, especially if your questions are numbered. Put a letter for the 3 questions which correspond to paragraph A, etc. As I've said before, a reading comprehension is testing your students' understanding. It is not testing, can you find the answer to this needle in a haystack test? Again, give everybody a chance for success, and also think about what you are evaluating in an official or non-official test. If you are evaluating the comprehension of reading, then I don't see why we should be checking spelling in the answers, unless they are perhaps specific words that you're working on in that unit, and make it clear which words will be evaluated or not. Your students with dyslexia will need longer to read and to answer questions because it takes more concentration and more cognitive load. That doesn't mean you have to give some students more time and not others, because everybody will work at their own speed. So ideally, you leave enough time for everybody. And when students are comfortable they've finished, perhaps you could have a fast finisher activity, some little word games, something ready for them to do. I'm not sure why putting the questions into the text would skew the results in favor of non-dyslexic students. It's going to be it's going to be easier for everybody. This is true, including the students with dyslexia. And I don't think it's going to make it more easier for those without dyslexia than those with. I think it helps all our students. And like I say, it's not search for the needle in a haystack. It's do you understand? If it's a good reading comprehension, the questions test your understanding of the text. And it's not going to be a question like, well, the text says John is 9 years old, and the question is, how old is John? Because I could probably do that in Spanish. Yes, it would definitely depend on the questions. Listening. So, time for me to have a sip of tea and you to do a bit of work. I would like you to write in the chat box 4 things you would tell your students to do before they listen to a text in a listening comprehension. And this is me giving very bad instructions because I've not written them down, but ideally 4 things you would do before they listen, 2 things they should do while they listen, and 2 things they should do after listening. Here's me having a sip of my tea. Oh, I love that. Relax. Feel how your body's breathing. Is your body ready for work? Yes. Yes, it's very simple, but a lot of the things are things we're doing or things that are really easy for us, but do we tell our students? At the beginning of the year, beginning of the course, the first time we do a listening comprehension, we spend probably about an hour looking at how to listen before we actually start listening to the text. Often we don't even start listening to the text until the next lesson. And we make a checklist that students have stuck in their book and that I ask them to refer to before every time we listen. Because sometimes it seems easy for us, but often these learning strategies are the things that students with specific educational needs, they don't have. And it's what gives them the autonomy and therefore the confidence in their learning. So look at the title, look at the images, brainstorm a list of words. Now, research is not conclusive about whether brainstorming words you think you'll hear is useful. It can be useful if you hear them, but if you don't know what the word is, brainstorming is not going to help you, which is logical, I guess. But I do feel it gets them on task. Look at the questions as you mentioned, and then guess the answers. Don't just look at the questions, but ask them to make logical guesses. If it's a text, if the photo is a boy in a school uniform and the question is, how old is he? Then he's going to be somewhere probably between the age of 7 and 18. So if it says 40, he's going to be 14, not 40, probably. So try and guess a few of the answers. I often always have the students who's, well, I don't know the answers, that's why we're listening. But try and guess them, because then they are listening for the age of the student within a smaller possible area than if they don't think about it before. Magic questions. So my students have to ask, do I answer in English or French? Because some of them, sometimes the official exams are in different languages. And how many times am I going to listen? Because if you turn up for an IELTS exam thinking you're going to actually just listen once for gist, you might be in trouble. So definitely check that. Another thing I do is let them listen as often as they like. Because why not? If you're listening to a recording, if you're listening to a podcast, you can go back. I often have to go back and listen to podcasts. So listen to it as often as they like. Definitely don't panic. Make notes while you're listening if it does not stop you listening. Don't sit there going, oh, what did he say for number 1? What did he say? Because you've missed everything else. So definitely the first time, listen for gist and maybe make notes later. Make notes if it helps, because again, short-term memory may be a challenge. Don't spend too long, as I said. Reread your answers and check they make sense. If they don't make sense, it's probably not the right answer. And yes, Doris, check. If it says 4-word answers, then it's not 5 or 7. I think it's always better to listen more than once, but some exams don't. So depending on what you're preparing your students for, prepare them for that as well. At least let them know how often they're going to hear it. And then just guess. No, there's no points for an empty space. If you can't remember what John had for breakfast, then write down what you think he might have for breakfast. You've still got a 1 in 50% chance of getting it right, as opposed to nothing. And exactly, yes, in real life, you can ask people to repeat or to write down their answers. There's many ways of us communicating. I'd also like to talk a little bit about oral presentations, because I think it's one of the things we forget with students with dyslexia. Short-term memory, planning, idea organization, and other things are going to make it difficult for some of your students with dyslexia. Don't just think, oh, because they have dyslexia, I'm going to get them to do an oral presentation. This will bring their marks up. It can still be very difficult. It can still be very stressful. So again, teach strategies for effective oral presentations. Help them in the planning stage, because this is often what they're going to find very difficult. How can they plan their ideas? So students with holistic ways of thinking may find mind maps really useful, and often SEND students see more the whole picture. So that might be one way of, then they can break it down into steps, what they want to talk about. Scaffold the beginning of sentences. So if you're giving an oral presentation on dogs, it could be dogs can be found, dogs look like, the average size, the average dog, dogs can, dogs do, just to encourage them to have their sentences in paragraphs. Help and encourage making notes. And I think that's so useful for all of my students, because so many of them come with huge chunks of things written out. Write out your text if you want, and then highlight the important bits that you shouldn't forget, and then take those highlights and put them on smaller cards. The other thing I encourage all my students to do is to use small pieces of paper, just simply because when you're standing in front of a big crowd, your big piece of paper when you're shaking, your big piece of paper will wobble. However, your small pieces of paper, one in front of the other, won't wobble. Nobody will see that. So that's definitely one thing for that. If it's quite important, and if they're going to be using many cards, this saves your life when you drop them on the floor 5 minutes before your speech and don't know what order they're in. So all my talks that I use notes for have a magic ring, piece of string, something like that. Very useful for us as well. And teach them oracy skills. Teach students the ideas of talking to the audience, of looking into the room in a kind of W form, or so that they can see different people and not just stare at one person. Teach them how to ask rhetorical questions. And for those students who are very nervous, and again, maybe your neurodiverse students who are not comfortable with looking people in the eye, ask them to fix a spot just above somebody's head towards the middle and the back of the classroom and talk there rather than talk to their feet for 10 minutes. So things like this can really help the students, or numbering your note cards, definitely. My essentials. So routines in the class, in the lesson, for me are so important. They are reassuring. They are a way of bringing in overlearning, the board plans, etc. By knowing what you're going to do at the beginning of the lesson, when you come into the classroom, it's always going to be the same thing. The teacher's going to ask for the day and the date, maybe give you the fact of the day, and then maybe remember what we did last lesson. Many of the things that ELT teachers do in language learning are what is recommended for primary and secondary teachers to help students with special education needs. For example, overlearning, every day looking at what are we looking at this week? Can anybody remember any of the words we saw? We looked at this word yesterday. Who can remember? Who can put it in a phrase? Reworking the vocab, reusing it. Students with specific education needs will need to see these words more often for them to sink in. So by doing that, that's going to make them, it lowers anxiety. It's going to help everybody know what we're doing. Same with exit cards. They're brilliant ways of practicing what we've learned during the class. Having a board plan, always putting the homework in the same place, the vocab in the same place, will really help your students who find it very hard to concentrate. Your students with short-term memory will find it hard, of course, to copy off the board. So avoid doing that. I'm not organized enough to have no writing on my board, of course. Things come up during class, but try and keep it to less than one line so they don't have trouble sort of copying and finding which lines they're in. Cardboard windows, of which, of course, I haven't got an example with me, but can be easily made with 2 pieces of L-shaped card that I am making just now. So I'm making mine out of paper. And with your cardboard window, you can then put it on the book, and it helps students concentrate and focus on the part of the book we're looking at. Because one of the things we see with textbooks and course books is you open your double-page spread and they are huge and flashing and things and vocab box and this and this and So to help a student calm down, find what they need to be looking at and look just at that, you can just give them some cardboard. They can make their own, they can colour them in, and a couple of paper clips so they can find what they're looking at. I always have a few coloured overlays that I mentioned earlier. So coloured overlays have been shown to help all students read more easily. You can have them like this. I don't know if you can see, it's got a little line, or like this, which are going to help the students stay on the right line as well. There's no reason why some colours work better than others, and they work for different people. Different people prefer different colours. So why not take some into class and let all your students try them out? These are one of the things that the first couple of times you do it, it's going to be really annoying. It's going to take longer. They're going to come up, try different ones, etc., etc. But stick with it, because after a couple of lessons, only the students who find them useful will come up and take them, and they'll know which ones they want. And as there's no scientific difference, there's no need to bicker over the colour. If there's not your colour left, just try a different one. Okay. You can buy them on that wonderful internet site that sells everything, but you can also buy them from the British Dyslexia Association, and I'm guessing quite a few online dyslexia shops, you will find them. I mentioned word mats. They're very simple checklists or anything you need that can be laminated and kept either in a poster format so all your students can see it, maybe around the board, or an individual format that students can keep on their desks. Those are my essentials. We could go on and talk a lot longer, but I'm going to let you get off pretty soon-ish. So first of all, I'd just like, if I haven't answered your question, could you just write it in the question box again?